And now I'm delighted to turn it over to my colleague, Professor Stephen Gasteyer in the Department of Sociology.
Good morning, everyone. This will be yet another panel where we have some exciting food for thought, and I've been pleased to see in the panels I've attended previously, there's been plenty of discussion. I think these three papers are likely to generate a very interesting conversation. In our panel today, we will have three papers. I would ask the panelists to try to restrict their comments to 15 minutes. All three of the panelists submitted written papers. I was able to get, because of time constraints, to two of them. But I will do my best to comment on all three. I will read the bios of each of the presenters before they present, and then they may present, as I said, for 15 minutes. I'll do my best to keep them to time. So our first presenter is Ashley Walters and Taryn. And Taryn Painter. They will be co-presenting. Ashley is a graduate student in the psychology at Connecticut. She holds a bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Dallas, as well as a master's in anthropology and a graduate certificate in human rights from the University of Connecticut. Her research interests include statelessness, human rights, citizenship, belonging, NGOs, and social movements. She will be presenting with Taryn Painter, and maybe you can say a couple of words about Taryn's background. Their presentation is Citizens of Nowhere, Stateless Muslims in the United States. So with that, I will give you all the floor.
Sure, really quickly, Taryn is an undergraduate and undergraduate at Towson University, and we've been working together for about a year now on stateless research. And then we actually have a third presenter, Danny, who's a directly impacted individual who'll be speaking with us as well.
Fantastic.
So to start really quickly, I want to specify we're using statelessness in terms of its definition under international law, which says a stateless person is, quote, a person who is not considered as a national by any state under the operation of its law, end quote. So by virtue of its birthright citizenship is recognized in Article 14 of the US Constitution, statelessness is erroneously viewed by American citizens and government officials as an issue solely affecting states abroad. Though it is true that Article 14 prevents the creation of generational statelessness within the US, current US law, or lack thereof, prevents the successful resolution of statelessness for an estimated 218,000 persons, including individuals from Muslim majority countries such as Iraq, Iran, Syria, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait. Currently, the US government does not have a definition of statelessness under federal law, lacks qualitative and quantitative data on its stateless population, and does not have an official process for obtaining information through censuses or other mechanisms. A 2012 report co-written by UNHCR and Open Society Initiative and estimated that the US was home to over 4,000 stateless persons, but acknowledges that the quality of statistics was very limited as they were only looking at asylum applications. In 2020, the Center for Migration Studies, an immigration think tank based in New York City, attempted to further map out the country's stateless population using a more robust methodology. The US was home to upwards of 218,000 stateless persons. The majority of these persons were born outside of the US and were unable to obtain nationality in their country of birth or lost nationality from their country of birth. They now live in the US, unable to be deported as no country will accept them. They're also unable to adjust their status or even gain legal status in the US to begin with. While they remain in indefinite limbo without legal options to address their issues, the US government continues to operate under the belief that it does not contribute to the issue of statelessness. With no significant action on the part of the US government, stateless individuals in the US remain at risk of prolonged detention, invasive ICE supervision, and drawn out unresolved legal battles. In addition, they face many challenges, including restrictions on work, movement, and identification. Both mental and physical health can be severely impacted by all these challenges, while adequate care for either can be challenging to obtain. In recent years, advocacy efforts to address statelessness in the US have been created and led by stateless persons themselves. USL, or United Stateless, a national organization founded by stateless individuals living in the US, has been at the forefront of this movement. Under the direction of stateless persons themselves, USL utilizes the stateless lived experience as its compass for advocacy and action. This paper seeks to expand on the advocacy work pursued by United Stateless and further bridge the gaps between lived experience, advocacy, and research. Through narrative interviews with 2 stateless impacted individuals from Muslim majority countries who are now living in the US, we explore the human impact of statelessness and underscore the need for immediate action on statelessness in the US. I'll now turn the presentation over to Danny, a directly impacted individual who will share her experience with statelessness.
Hi, my name is Danny Eliati. I was born stateless. I inherited that from my father. I come from Kuwait. My entire family's from Kuwait. Due to the strict laws, a woman cannot pass down her citizenship. It left us in limbo. We traveled from Kuwait, and when we came to United, we did not understand the idea that United States does not have a law that exists for stateless people, only for refugees. When we migrated here, we applied for asylum, but we was rejected. Until I got older, I fully understood what it means to be stateless. We cannot, every time we go to the embassy, my siblings and I, they does not consider us as Kuwaiti citizens. And when we go to United States and try to adjust our status, there is no law for us to actually adjust our status as residents. Living as a stateless person in the United States, it's really hard. Coming from people, my own community, the Arab community, did not understand that. So they assumed that I'm a Kuwaiti citizen and I was from my community. So I was left to be accepted by other communities, which they did not criticize me where I was from. They understood that I was stateless, but being able to speak that you're stateless was really hard because I did not want people to pity me or think that I'm just a refugee. So I kept it to myself until I got older, and I had enough because of work-related issues. I was not able to work until I was in custody with ICE. As I was in custody in ICE, I spent 2 months in detention, and it was a hard thing to do because being in detention and waiting from your mother, and the U.S. government trying to get Kuwait to deport me, it was an issue. Kuwait refused, and once I was released from detention, that's when I was able, a couple of years later, to apply for work authorization. Now, between me and my siblings, not all of us have a work authorization because not all of us reported to ICE. So we are left right now with basically went through poverty. Stateless people go through poverty because we cannot apply to any government assistance. It's hard for us to work because we have no work experience. And for a job to accept us, it's basically a 20% chance. So living through the poverty and then losing our home, because only my mother is a Kuwaiti citizen and she had her retirement. It was difficult. My siblings did not have work history or anything like that. As the laws got stricter in the United States with housing and other stuff, it became harder for us. It became for a stateless person to apply for certain banks because we need a passport. Every door we try to knock on, it's basically we get rejected because we are not citizens or we can't prove our citizenship from any other country. So we need a passport to apply. And it became such a difficult moment for us until I became a part of United Stateless, a community full of stateless people, and understanding that there is other people like me, not from only the Middle East, people from Europe, everywhere. Understanding that I'm not the only one who's going through this. And slowly, being a part of United Stateless really opened my eyes and made me realize sharing my experience, trying to help other stateless to navigate through life. As a living in the daily life is really difficult because you don't know what's going to happen to you. You report to ICE, you don't know what ICE will do in detention or release you. So it's like living in fear, living in a shadow. So basically, I do not exist. I just basically I live in the shadows and just navigate my way through on a daily basis. I used to have a future plan, and now I can't have a future plan. I have to live day by day. The longest plan I could do is 2 weeks from now because I don't know what's going to happen to me or what's going to happen to my family.
And now we'll turn
That's
it
it.
over to Taryn, who will share on behalf of May, another stateless individual in the US.
Thank you, Ashley. Now we'll share with you the story of May and her son, Hassan, both of whom's names have been changed to protect their privacy. The specific country where May's story takes place will only be referred to as Middle Eastern country throughout this retelling as well. Though details of May's experience have been changed, the crux of her story has not. May is a citizen of 2 countries, yet for 9 years struggled to provide her son with accurate official documentation and a nationality. May was born in the United States, granting her birthright American citizenship. She spent the first 12 years of her life on the West Coast before her mother moved the family back to a Middle Eastern country where May held dual blood right citizenship. She spent the rest of her young adult years in this country, eventually meeting a Syrian man with whom she wished to marry and start a family. As her proposed husband was a Syrian citizen and not a citizen of the country that she lived in, she had to apply for permission from the Minister of Interior to marry. It was during this process that May first became aware of her inability to pass on her Middle Eastern citizenship to her children, since the country is one of 27 countries globally where mothers do not have equal rights as fathers to pass on citizenship. Likewise, she could not pass on her American citizenship because she did not meet the residency requirement, which requires US citizen parents to be physically present in the US for 5 years, at least 2 of which were after reaching the age of 14. Understanding all of these gaps, May planned to place her children under her sponsorship in the Middle Eastern country when they were born, which would then entitle the child to be treated as legal for as long as May was alive. However, after giving birth to Hassan, her husband refused to obtain a birth certificate for him. When she attempted to get a birth certificate herself, she was told that mothers could not obtain them for their children, and that only the father or the father's family could collect it. She eventually was able to obtain a birth certificate for her son, but one that listed him as having no nationality. Though there was now legal documentation of his birth, Hassan remained stateless. May persevered and began to conduct independent research on the nationality laws of the country. She discovered that if a child is born to a mother with citizenship of the country and a stateless father or a father of unknown nationality, then the child can receive citizenship. Since Hassan's father registered himself as unknown nationality in May's Middle Eastern country, she attempted to get Hassan's citizenship under this part of the law, but was ultimately denied. May and Hassan's father eventually divorced, which added additional excuses for the government to use against her applications for her son. She would continue to try and get Hassan's status, but was denied under the premise that her marriage was not approved by the Ministry of Interior. But then, during a chance encounter at the visitation center where Hassan would meet with his father, May met Angela, a US citizen who encouraged May to contact the US Embassy. After contacting the embassy, May was told that an I-130 would be needed in order for Hassan to travel to the US where he could receive citizenship. Under US law, Hassan would qualify for US citizenship if he lived on US soil with a US citizen parent before the age of 18. So if Hassan could move to the US, he could get US citizenship. However, official documentation other than the birth certificate issued to May was required in the I-130 form, which Hassan still did not have. Desperate to get a form of documentation accepted for the I-130, May traveled to a rural city in the north of the Middle Eastern country where a stateless person could be issued IDs and was finally able to get an ID for Hassan. But the ID she received spelled his name wrong and expired in less than a week. Knowing that this flawed ID would not be accepted for the I-130, May reached out to US Senator's office, who then advocated on her behalf to the US Embassy in the Middle Eastern country, resulting in Hassan's I-130 being approved. The US later issued a visa stamped on a paper waiver to allow Hassan to travel. All that May and her son had to wait on was permission from the Middle Eastern government to travel to the US. The Middle Eastern country would not allow them to travel, but May went every day to the approval office, interacting with different workers each day to see if someone could help her obtain an exit document to leave the country. Her persistence finally paid off, and she was able to obtain an exit visa for her son. However, the government only issued an exit visa for her son and not her so that she could accompany him abroad. May continued to show up to the office trying to obtain permission to travel with Hassan. After 3 rejections, she finally spoke with an officer who sympathized with her situation, granted her permission, and told her to go save her son's life. Understanding that her permission could be revoked by the Middle Eastern country, she drove 10 hours to get the next flight out of the country and onto US soil. Upon arriving in the US in 2020, sorry, 1 more minute?
2 more minutes.
2 more, okay. Angela, the woman who helped May get into contact with the US Embassy, picked her up from the airport and helped her settle into new life in the US. She began working on getting her son American citizenship, which he was now eligible for. However, there were some difficulties obtaining official documents for him, as there were different spellings and names for her son. The US needed this country to correct the errors for Hassan's documents could be accepted. The office in the Middle Eastern country that May and her son left agreed to correct the names for the benefit of the child, which led May to think about why he was suddenly a child who they would help after so many years of resistance. With the corrected documents, the help of a US lawyer and United Stateless, Hassan finally received his passport and is now an official US citizen. Though Hassan is no longer stateless and May no longer has to fight to get her child documentation, they continue to deal with the mental impacts and trauma all those years caused. Every time I tell anybody my story, says May, it brings tears to my eyes because when you say it, it's short. I can say it in a few minutes, but it was a really long struggle and it was really hard. People could have done better and people could have helped. Though May and Hassan's story has a happy resolution, this isn't the reality for many mothers of stateless children around the Muslim world. May hopes that telling her story will make people aware that individuals from the US who hold American citizenship are directly impacted by statelessness, and that changes need to be made to US law to prevent any parent and child from enduring what she and her son experienced. She also hopes that sharing her lived experience will show others that gender discrimination persists to this day and prevents mothers from providing their children the lives they deserve.
And then the last thing we wanted to state was we have had one positive development actually attributed to advocacy efforts by stateless individuals like Danny. On December 15th, 2021, the Department of Homeland Security announced that it would, quote, commit to providing greater protections for stateless persons present in the country, end quote. They haven't provided further details, but this is a significant step forward towards acknowledging statelessness in the US. Thank you.
Excellent. Very nicely done. Any quick clarifying questions from the audience? We'll come back to the longer discussion later, but any quick clarifying questions? All right, so we'll move on to the second paper. The second paper is by Zainab Saleh, who is an assistant professor of anthropology at Haverford University. She unfortunately fell ill today, and so she has asked that we read her paper for her. So I'm going to try to do that. Zainab Saleh is interested in questions of empire and colonialism, belonging and subjectivity, migration and diaspora, and violence and knowledge production. In her scholarship, she tries to examine how formations of subjectivity, understandings of temporality, and constructions of a sense of home in a diasporic context have been situated in structures of power and shifting terrains of class, political, gender, and religious sensibilities. I will note that she is the author of 2 other books, Return to Ruin, Iraqi Narratives of Exile and Nostalgia from 2021, and one other that I'm not finding for right now. But with that, let me move on to trying to read her paper, and I'll try to keep time on myself and make sure I don't go too long. Okay. One hot summer day in 2007, I was walking toward a cafe near Paddington in the center of London to meet with Hazar. I did not know what to expect because my meeting with her was arranged by a commonplace acquaintance, and I had not had the chance to communicate directly with her. The only information I had was that I was meeting her near the law firm where she worked, and that her family had been deported from Iraq in 1980. As I approached the cafe, I saw a tall, slim, veiled woman sitting. Let's see. Sorry, a tall, thin, veiled woman sitting outside eating Middle Eastern food. When I introduced myself, Hazar, who like me was in her early 30s at the time, welcomed me warmly, and our conversation flowed smoothly. During our conversation, Hazar told me how Saddam Hussein's tyranny shattered her world when she was young. At the age of 7, she was snatched from the comfort of her middle-class home and taken to the Iran-Iraq border by security agents because her father was Tabaiya, an Iraqi of Iranian origin. Her family's deportation was part of the regime's massive expulsion campaign in the early 1980s that targeted Shia Arabs and Shia Kurds, like Hazar's family, who had held Persian nationality under the Ottomans and who came to be seen as a threat to the Iraqi nation under the Saddam Hussein regime. Deportees had their documents, property, and belongings confiscated. Stateless and penniless, Hazar's family found themselves in a new country where they did not speak the language or have the means to start anew. While Hazar's father was an established merchant in Baghdad, who had provided his family with a comfortable life, he could not establish a business in Iran to provide the same standard for the family had enjoyed in Iraq, and the family suffered financially. Hazar's family was also confronted with Persian nationalism. Iranians perceive them as others, specifically as Arabs, though they are Kurds, who did not belong in Iran, even though they were Shia Muslims, and the family had relatives. This furthered her family's inability to start anew in Iran. After 9 years of economic hardship and marginalization, Hazar's family relocated to London, where one of her brothers lived, worked, and supported his family. The family decided that they had no future in Iran and that the return to Iraq was no longer feasible with the consolidation of Hussein's power. Britain offered the prospects of a secure and comfortable life, though it was culturally different from the Middle East. Hazar's parents found a new home where they felt their children could have a better future. Hazar also dwelled at length on how the questions of selfhood and home became a pressing issue for her from a young age. In Iran, her family, particularly her eldest sisters who age in Iraq, had grown anxious that Hazar was taking on Iranian rather than Iraqi norms and manners. Familial expectations complicated Hazar's desire to blend in with Iranian society and to escape the label of Arab. And in Britain, she felt that she was the other because of her veil, life experiences, and accent, and she missed Iran terribly. Her identity crisis reached its peak when she was in her mid-20s. At that time, Hazar felt lost, confused, and alienated from her family, and her social life revolved around her friends. But at the age of 27, she experienced a turning point in her life when she read a book about the struggle of young people with religious by a renowned Lebanese Shia scholar. The book renewed her faith and an anchor, starting her on a journey to reconnect with her roots and religion. Hazar went on a pilgrimage to Mecca for the first time, and then went to Damascus to visit a Shia holy shrine. After the fall of Saddam Hussein, Hazar went to Iraq, which she hadn't been able to do for almost 2 decades. The visit provided her with an Iraqi experience she had always missed when she listened to her sisters reminisce about their lives in Iraq. It also cemented her Shia faith through her visits to the holy shrine in Najaf and Karbala. Hazar's search for roots took her on routes that spanned different cities. At the same time, she began to develop a strong British identity rooted in the notion of hybridity. Britishness became an inclusive marker of identity that encompassed different aspects of belonging, whereby Hazar could claim that she was Muslim British or Iraqi British at the same time. London became a place from which she embarked upon recurring journeys that shaped her multiple identities as Iraqi, Shia, Muslim, and British. Since I met Hazar in 2006, she has been to Mecca, Baghdad, Karbala, and Najaf many times. She constantly felt the need to make these journeys to affirm her Shia faith and her sense of belonging to her Iraqi Kurdish roots. It was through the performance of religious rituals and mundane Iraqi acts, such as eating certain dishes or taking walks in certain neighborhoods in Baghdad, that Hazar cultivated a religious and national identity rooted in these places. Constant journeys, however, were defined by unexpected encounters that shifted Hazar's notion of home subjectivity. When I interviewed her in 2018, she emphasized the importance of a British identity to her, though she still identified as an Iraqi British. She thought of her previous identity as a Shia Iraqi and Kurdish Iraqi that were extenuated due to her frequent visits to Iraq and to Saudi Arabia. During her trip to Iraq in 2014, Hazar decided to get her family national documents so they could properties that were confiscated from them under the Saddam Hussein regime. Hazar's experience with the Iraqi bureaucracy shook her Iraqiness. She was faced with a corrupt system defined by long delays and expectations of bribes. She was also vocal when people cut in line. Her attitude, refusing to give bribes and insisting that people wait their turn, made her an object of ridicule. People laughed at her and told her that she was an outsider coming from London. Moreover, during her trip, Hazar saw more cruelty in Baghdad, such as a woman hiring a child to carry her heavy groceries, or a man kicking a child for making a mistake. She thought these cruel acts would not be tolerated in the United Kingdom, where child protection procedures penalize such acts. These experiences made Hazar feel that she did not fit in. She thought that she faced something during the trip that she did not want to be part of. In addition, daily life in Iraq seemed to get more difficult with each trip. Hazar remarked that during the trip, I could see everything. I could see the traffic, the meaninglessness. It was so ridiculous why people had to live like that. The fear of bombing, the fear whether you'll come back or not come back. Though Hazar felt that she wanted to belong to Iraq, she was happy that she could leave the country. In addition, different trips to Mecca and Medina to perform the Hajj or Umrah, Hazar met more Sunni Muslims who had similar views of her, except that they believed that Omar and Abu Bakr, rather than Imam Ali, were the chosen ones. Though Hazar saw herself as a practicing Shia Muslim who followed Imam Ali and commemorated Ashura, being simply a Muslim became more important to her. For instance, back in 2006, Hazar thought that she would never marry a non-Shia man. But a decade later, sectarian differences were no longer an important issue to her. Hazar's frequent trips to Saudi Arabia caused a shift in her understanding of faith. The performance of Hajj and Umrah with millions of other Muslims at the same time enabled her to carve a Muslim subjectivity open to the broader Muslim world beyond the Shia doctrine. Hazar also began to have more difficulty connecting with her Kurdishness. She still could not connect to Iraqi Kurds in northern Iraq due to linguistic differences. Hazar spoke Faili Kurdish, dominant among Shia Kurds, while the majority of the Iraqi Kurds spoke Sorani Kurdish. And different imaginations of the future of the Kurds within the Iraqi state. Hazar also felt alienated from the idea of Kurdish racial superiority embraced by the two main Iraqi Kurdish parties in Kurdistan, since it prioritized the notion of race over the conceptualization of Iraq. She prioritized the integrity of the Iraqi nation state over an independent Kurdistan. What defined her relationship to Shia Kurdishness was a familial connection. In particular, the connection to her father and his family from Iran, rather than the nationalistic affiliation with Kurdistan. Hazar went to the city on the Iran-Iraq border from which her grandfather hailed to become acquainted with her Kurdish roots. Moreover, Hazar's understanding of her Kurdishness had a third element. Hazar ascribed her independence and strong character to the fact that she is a Kurd, other cultures, and that a Kurdish woman is her own boss. Being an independent woman became closely intertwined with Kurdishness in Hazar's narrative, while faith and national belonging became loosely associated with Iraq over the years. Family roots and female independence were linked to Kurdishness. These enduring identities, whether Iraqi, Shia, Muslim, or Kurdish, made Hazar feel more British. When we spoke in 2006, it was much more about being Iraqi, and that meant a lot to me. It is now that, but it is no longer a strong part. I'm Iraqi, I'm Kurdish, I'm Muslim, I'm Shia. These are all my identities, but I think my Britishness comes up a lot more. I think being British allowed me to be different. While if you're Iraqi, it is either this or that. Being British means you can be Asian, Chinese, Black African, Middle Eastern. In that way, I always say being British is a combination. I'm British Iraqi. Previously, I was Iraqi, Shia, Muslim. I'm not sure if that is a major identity for me at this stage. It was at that in my life. Maybe my Britishness is very much about my ideology in life and the way I see other people. Home was not a stable, fixed, or taken for granted thing for Hazar. Home for Hazar has been a shifting, contested notion that has constantly needed to be reaffirmed through the journeys to other places. It is rooted in, routed through multiple locations, but with the ongoing expectation of homecoming. Hazar constantly embarked on journeys to Baghdad, Najaf, Karbala, and Mecca, only to come back home to London, and then to start a new journey whenever she had the opportunity. While she yearned for abroad, but as soon as she was away, she yearned for London. It is through these processes of homecoming that Hazar carved an Iraqi British and Muslim British subjectivity, which marked a shift in hegemonic discourse on Iraqi subjectivity, centered on national struggle and political activism. Each journey made her feel anchored and affirmed some aspect of her identity, because these journeys enabled her to establish roots in specific places and enjoy everyday experiences that she missed. Hazar's narrative indicated generational shifts in understanding of home and subjectivity. Hazar, the construction of home and subjectivity was an ongoing process that was informed by middle-class familial memories of Iraq, religious faith, and the experiences of marginalization and exclusion in exile. Hazar's life story provides an alternative to the hegemonic discourse endorsed by some about Iraq as a hub of progressive politics, anti-colonial struggle, and cultural renaissance. It speaks to the experiences of Iraqis who were not politically inclined, but who still suffered persecution under Saddam Hussein's regime. The fashioning of an Iraqi self in this instance was rooted in the everyday, such as walking in Baghdad or eating Iraqi dishes, sharing tales of direct persecution, and having religious experiences. Moreover, Hazar's narrative indicates the multiple ways in which religious subjectivity is constant. Hazar aimed to carve an Iraqi religious subjectivity through travel and through her personal pursuit to understand religion, to find answers to challenges she faced as an exiled individual who inhabited different places. Religion was not just a relationship between God and the person, but also a platform to carve a subjectivity situated in different localities. So with that, we can then move on to our next speaker, who is Thomas McGee. So Thomas McGee is a PhD researcher at the Peter McCullen Center for Statelessness in Melbourne Law School in Australia. His project traces how the phenomenon of statelessness has been transformed since the start of conflict in the country in 2011. Thomas's research is grounded in his humanitarian practitioner experiences in the Levant, and he is also currently co-editing a book entitled Stateless in the Middle East and North Africa, Emerging Movements for Change. So with that, I would like to welcome Thomas McGee, whose paper will be Syria Statelessness Landscape, Protracted Situations and the Ticking Time Bomb. Dr. McGee.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephen. I'll just try and share the screen if I can.
Oh, let me see if yes, perfect.
Okay. Can you see that? Okay, great. So my paper today looks at how the nature of statelessness in and associated more broadly with Syria has changed since the outbreak of conflict in the country after 2011, sorry. So I approach this subject using the concept of landscape and more broadly statelessness landscape to interrogate how institutional power and privileged knowledge are often embedded within work on statelessness, but also how individuals affected by statelessness can recenter and reframe understandings of what it means to be stateless around their own experiences of the issue. So to explore this question, I will try to unpack some of the terms in the title of my paper. The first, similar to the first presentation we had today, is the term statelessness, and I'm equally working with the definition enshrined in international law, which, as we've already heard, based on the 1954 convention, states that a stateless person is somebody who is not considered as a national by any state under the operation of its law. Again, in other words, this refers to somebody who is simply not a citizen of any country. On the face of it, this might seem relatively straightforward, but likewise, as we've already heard, this definition doesn't actually tell us very much about who this person is. what they've experienced, or why they're in the situation. So I argue that building on this legal framework, the discourse of humanitarian protection, and equally some of that within the emerging statelessness studies literature, has produced a generic figure of the stateless person, which really fails to convey the complexity and diversity of what it means to be stateless. That is, the various origins of the phenomenon and the equally diverse human experiences as a consequence of being stateless. So here I draw on anthropologist Lisa Malki's observation about the human subjectivity of refugees, when she stresses that the term refugee has analytical usefulness not as a label for a special generalizable kind or type of person or situation, but only as a broad legal or descriptive rubric that includes within it a world of different socioeconomic statuses, personal histories, and psychological or spiritual situations. And I find this really useful, and I actually believe that perhaps this characterization might even apply to stateless people even more than it does to refugees, since the definition of statelessness depends on a negative characterization, that is, not being a national. So as such, we really, based on the definition, know nothing of a stateless person beyond what they are not. So here, I'm looking at the prevailing discourse within global statelessness literature, which tends to reduce the complexity of the issue in a number of ways. It often assumes that statelessness problems in a particular country have a singular cause, or that all or most stateless people in that country experience generally similar hardships. The United Nations, more specifically the Refugee Agency, UNHCR, launched its I Belong campaign to eradicate statelessness by 2024. And this further emphasizes the linear trajectory of reducing the problem over time. The example of Syria, I believe, challenges this neat narrative. The conflict there, I contest, has led to a diversification of Syria's statelessness. And this brings me on to the second term to be unpacked in the title, and that is the compound expression of statelessness landscape. So this is a construct that I'm using to explore the complex and enmeshed legislative, institutional, and bureaucratic architecture and practices that produce statelessness and determine its meaning in context. So drawing on approaches from the revived field of landscape research that largely developed within cultural geography from the 1970s, landscapes are considered to be socially constructed and continually evolving. Here, reference to the German term Landschaft from the verb schaffen, literally to create or produce, very much underscores this constructed nature. So the concept of statelessness landscape I found to be useful to facilitate study of the interactions between lived experience and discourse relating to statelessness. As you can see in the diagram on the slide, I've here highlighted some of the key actors involved in Syria's statelessness landscape. You have obviously stateless people themselves inside the country and outside. You have the Syrian government, its legislation, and then on the left you can see some of the international actors, primarily UN agencies. And on the right, I'm highlighting a set of actors that have become increasingly involved in statelessness issues relating to Syria since 2011, when the conflict began. So due to conflict-induced displacement and asylum journeys of stateless Syrians, foreign courts and asylum agencies are now increasingly playing a role in determining the meaning and experience of statelessness in the Syrian context. So the main research questions of my project, of my research in general, are: what does Syria's changing statelessness landscape since the start of the conflict reveal about the prevailing international discourses on statelessness? And secondly, how does the ground reality of statelessness in Syria offer new insights into the study of statelessness? And as I've already touched upon, my hypothesis here is that the case of Syria really exposes some of the deficiencies and limitations of mainstream presentation of statelessness as both a largely static and simplified phenomenon. So moving on now to look at the Syrian context more specifically, I'd like to give a few brief details about statelessness in Syria historically. And this is also to respond to the question of why Syria is an important case study for understanding dynamics of statelessness. So firstly, to unpack the expression that's also in the title of this paper, protracted situations. Unfortunately, having no nationality is not a new phenomenon in Syria, since the country was already home to one of the largest populations of stateless people in the world prior to the war. More than 400,000 Palestinians and some 300,000 stateless Kurds. So these two main groups both became stateless as a result of specific historic events. The 1948 Nakba in the case of the Palestinians, and subsequent further expulsions from historic Palestine. And for the Kurds, it's the 1962 discriminatory census that took place in Syria's most northeastern Hasaka governorate, which deprived 120,000 people of citizenship almost overnight. Additionally, the country has always had gender-based discrimination embedded in its nationality law and practice, so that Syrian mothers cannot pass on nationality to children on the same basis as Syrian fathers. And here it's interesting, it's often incorrectly considered, even sometimes by Syrians themselves, that the origins of such gender discriminatory provisions within the nationality law result from, which can themselves result in cases of statelessness, of course, are found within Islamic teachings and jurisprudence. This is not the case. And it's moreover, in reality, the risks of statelessness should be attributed in their origin to the legacy of colonial action, since it was the French authorities in Syria and likewise the British elsewhere in the Middle East who introduced these gender discriminatory measures within the first nationality codes. While France and equally Britain went on to reform their own nationality laws to remove gender inequality, the provision has remained untouched in Syria's legislation until today. So my research examines how various profiles of people affected by statelessness have had different historic and recent experiences of the issue. I don't have much time to go into it here, but this includes how Palestinian refugees from Syria, while not citizens, were largely able to access many of the rights enjoyed by citizens before 2011. And that's in contrast to Palestinians in other parts of the Middle East, and equally in contrast to stateless Kurds in Syria, who had very different experiences and were unable to access many of the basic services. The situations of Palestinians and Kurds have also been framed very differently against the backdrop of Arab ethnic identity. While both groups are primarily Muslim, the Palestinians were often viewed in official discourse as Arab brothers, while a report by a Syrian intelligence official described Kurds in Syria as a malignant tumor. So here it's important to note equally the appropriateness of the term statelessness and recognize that it's often debated, particularly in reference to Palestinian refugees. Some Palestinians from Syria may reject to self-define as stateless, given that they felt they were well integrated within Syrian society, and others may consider based on some of my interviews, consider the term self-defeating for the claim to Palestinian statehood, or otherwise preserving the right to return. But this is quite a contested issue. So Another reason to study statelessness in Syria is the series of interesting developments that have taken place since 2011. Firstly, after decades of refusing to respond to calls of stateless Kurds for inclusion in the body of citizens, suddenly, in the context of the uprisings related to the Arab Spring in 2011, the Syrian government made a decision to naturalize one section of this stateless Kurdish community. This was largely viewed as a concession made for political reasons, since the government felt under pressure because of the popular uprising across the country, and thereby hoped to deter Kurdish involvement in protests. And this action resulted in one of the major changes that's reflected in the UN's statistics on Syria. They show a reduction from 300,000 stateless people in Syria to 160,000 from 2011 till today. Another major post-2011 development is a large number of stateless Syrians have been displaced outside the country. And I look at this displacement statelessness nexus with a view to understanding how the situation has led to stateless individuals having new experiences outside the country as they've come into contact with asylum procedures in other countries. So stateless asylum seekers often had quite different experiences from other Syrians, meaning Syrian citizens. And this included challenges in getting their statelessness identified within the asylum procedure, or even to convince authorities that they were genuinely from Syria. Next,
about 4 minutes, okay?
Perfect, that's great. So next, I've also, and related to this displacement context, there have been new risks of statelessness as well for children born to Syrian parents outside the country. These risks are heightened by the gender discrimination that I already mentioned in law, and also when children are born outside government control in other parts of Syria. So when births are not registered and confirmed with the state authorities, there is increased risk of statelessness. A final recent development is that of foreign states cancelling the citizenship of nationals who are in Syria and suspected of engagement with the Islamic State. So in providing a more nuanced and I hope comprehensive account of Syria's changing statelessness landscape, I would like to thereby challenge and complicate some of the narratives presented by actors within the statelessness sector. Here we see UNHCR, for example, citing the reduction in the stateless Kurds as a major milestone in its campaign to eradicate statelessness. That may be true numerically, and it's certainly a step in the right direction to eliminating statelessness, both in Syria and globally. But we should be cautious of presenting it as an uncomplicated success story of reduction of statelessness, given that many Kurds themselves felt uncomfortable about the context in which it took place. The presidential decree that overnight opened the doors to naturalization only targeted one part of the stateless Kurds, so has been seen as a continuation of the divide and rule policies by the state. At the same time, no acknowledgement of the historic deprivation the community had faced was given. And there was a lot of controversy around the terminology of the decree. It simply granted rather than returned or confirmed the citizenship. And it was felt that this was an erasure of the decades-long injustice and the political persecution behind their statelessness. This led, as we can see in the image here, to some expressions from within the Kurdish community of protest against essentially the naturalization or the framing of it. Here we can see we're all against corruption, but we don't want citizenship. We don't want citizenship, but we want freedom. So finally, another inconsistency relates to the risk of statelessness for Syrian children. It's interesting to note here that, again, the UNHCR spokesperson referred to this problem as a ticking time bomb in a media piece designed to highlight the need for continued fundraising of the agency's Syria response. At the same time, this potential increase in the risk of statelessness is not featured anywhere in the discourse of the same agency's campaign on eradicating statelessness. So this risk of a ticking time bomb does not feature within the statistics at all. So just to conclude, looking back on the last 10 years, it's clear that the conflict has both created new cases and new risks of statelessness, and it's also transformed existing situations of statelessness, creating new experiences, and sometimes new vulnerabilities for those already stateless. And this has resulted in what I argue to be a diversification of the statelessness landscape, and equally an expansion of it beyond Syria's borders to include new territories due to the conflict-induced displacement. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Dr. McGee. That was a very interesting talk. So we've had, it's my role to be the discussant. I'm not going to take a lot of time. I would just like to note some of what I saw as commonalities across these three very interesting papers. In all three cases, they talk about the Walters Painter paper that we began with was very interesting in giving us two cases to look at statelessness and sort of the drivers, some very interesting drivers of statelessness, specifically for Middle Eastern people, and this intersection of bureaucracy and hierarchies and discrimination within the sending country, so to speak, perspective, but also in both cases a good bit of patriarchy and the legacies of patriarchy as creating this condition of statelessness. But then a discussion that hinted at, and this will be one of the things I would like Painter and Walters and Danny maybe to talk about a bit more, but hinted at a very significant movement that's developed around getting stateless people's status in the context of the United States at least. And they talked about the State Department action, which is more in the form of a declaration at this point than anything substantive. But what is it that they would like at the end of the day in terms of what's the goal of the movement, right? That actually feeds into what Zainab Saleh's piece, which I read, was really gives us a much more personal account and doesn't as much delve into the bureaucratic architecture, which is really what Dr. McGee talks about, as it does into the very personal experience of being stateless, and then the sense of belonging or lack of belonging from that, which really raises a question of how does this belonging get manufactured? What are the kinds of mechanisms in place that can create a situation where somebody belongs feels that they belong? It is very notable that the ultimate belonging, the ongoing legacy of discrimination across the Middle East, happens in the old colonial metropole of England, rather than in any of the other places across the Middle East from which the national origin, from which Hazar comes as a person of Iraqi, Iranian Shia descent, right? Get to Dr. McGee's excellent article, which really talks about the chat talks about this narrative of statelessness and the problem with the narrative as having repercussions within the bureaucratic architecture of addressing statelessness. And how that's exemplified in the context of Syria, that we really think of stateless people from Syria, and yet there's very different contexts if you're talking about Palestinians who may have had a great deal of belonging in Syria prior to 2011, but ultimately their status in terms of the global architecture was married to a refugee status, which pinned them to the Syrian state. And so now you have these issues outside, or the Kurds who were disenfranchised by that very Syrian state, only to be enfranchised. But then we get back to these very interesting questions of belonging, right? And the politics of belonging. So this interesting problem of what it means to be stateless. And then of course, this additional issue of the ISIS fighters who are pushed into stateless status by often by European governments that disavow them of their citizenship as a result of their status. I suppose the question I would have for Dr. McGee is really around this. So as you raise some troubling issues, but what is the next step? How do we move to a solution? So it really puts Thomas McGee's paper into direct dialogue with the Walters Painter article that we began with. With that, I think, would the panelists like to respond quickly, and then we can open up for a broader discussion?
Yeah, we can start. Danny can address the movement United Stateless.
Yeah, so United Stateless, when we established United Stateless, is because myself and other members realized that we've been living in the United States for years, and we realized that there's a lot of organizations really talk about refugees. The problem is that not every stateless person is a refugee. A lot of people confuse that. So there's only people who are considered stateless because they migrated when they were young and they cannot say that they're refugees. The law doesn't apply for them. So when we established that, is because we wanted to build a community for stateless people, to seek help for them, and to push laws and get Congress to acknowledge statelessness and to give them a pathway to citizenship. United Stateless is, we develop different committees trying to help stateless people on a daily life, trying to help them get identification, work authorization, trying to see their cases, because a lot of these cases are being rejected because they don't fall under the asylum laws. Each year we try to take problems from the stateless communities and come back as a board and actually try to solve certain problems. A lot of the problem that's happening with stateless people is that either they cannot work, or they don't have proper identification, they cannot open bank account, they stuck in a dilemma in a shadow. So I don't know if a lot of people heard about the municipal ID, like New York, they established that for really the undocumented people, but it also gave stateless people a way to get that ID to present themselves. So that little success really reflects big for the stateless community, because that's something that we never had. Now we have it. Being able to exist, an ID is really important to us. Able to navigate through our daily life. And each year we communicate with a lot of refugee organizations, different organizations, to even tell them, hey, do you know if there's a stateless person that came across you? Can you please give them our information? There's no really a way to tell who are stateless, who's not. Every stateless person have a different story. So like for myself, I was born stateless. I know other stateless people who became stateless as they were older. So there's no clear definition or an example of how a person becomes stateless.
And I can just add really fast to your answer about what we want from the government. We want them to adopt a definition of statelessness, specifically the international law definition we've talked about. We want them to create the statelessness determination procedure, enact it, have it be readily accessible to individuals and timely completed. And then federal laws need to be passed that will allow individuals found to be stateless a pathway to citizenship in the US, stopping prolonged detentions of individuals unable to be deported, giving work authorization more easily, and then allowing identification, like Danny said. We do have legislation written called the Stateless Protection Act. Right now, it's not anywhere in Congress, but that's also something we're thinking about, is using legislation.
Fascinating. Good. That's interesting. So moving from the U.S. specific to the international, Thomas McGee, would you like to provide any additional points?
Sure. And if I may, if I could first just clarify that I'm not Dr. McGee, because this is my PhD project.
Okay. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think building on a lot of what has been said by our colleagues in United Stateless, when you were asking about solutions for us in the looking at, for me, the Syria context really highlights this very fragmented landscape, and that's generally a characteristic of the Middle East and North Africa context in general. Often we see that different communities affected by statelessness or different individual profiles don't necessarily identify with one another. So often, for example, you might have the Bedouin in Kuwait and then other communities in North Africa, and they consider that they have almost nothing in common, even though they're both impacted by this issue of statelessness. So I think similar to what the United Stateless are doing in a quite different context, I would consider that building solidarity among individuals and communities affected by the issue is a major focus of a solution. And an organization that I've been involved in is the recently established MENA Statelessness Network. And that's the mandate of that organization pretty much. So I think trying to build this sense of fostering the possibility to explore these similarities and differences, I think, is really, really important. Obviously, I'm not suggesting to impose that people should necessarily identify together if they don't feel it, but I think fostering the possibility for exploring these connections between different people affected by the issue is really important, especially when there are such often strong obstacles towards in the Middle East. Stateless citizenship issues are generally considered outside the courts, so often there might be very little avenue for legal progress. So building this sense of solidarity and peer learning across different contexts, I think, is really valuable.
Excellent. All right, I would like to open it up for others who may have questions. I know I can take questions through the Q&A, but I think we can all just turn off our mics and speak as well. Is that not right, Mohammed or?
Yes, and of course, people can also raise their hands. The presenters can raise their hands, and others can type in their questions in the Q&A.
Fantastic. So are there other questions, comments, concerns? So any other, I don't want to dominate the conversation, although I could keep talking about this. So I'm actually, I think the comments that you just made, Thomas, are really quite interesting in terms of the need for solidarity groups. This issue of statelessness. I mean, one of the themes that runs through these papers is that the old old Arab nationalist ideas has been part of the and then overlaid on what turn out to be colonial legacies of patriarchy are among the key drivers in this process, right? And one of the things I think would be interesting to think about is whether we're at a point now where there's opportunities for a discussion about those points, right? You're dealing with regimes across the Middle East that are still in power, but deeply delegitimized in many ways, right? The Syrian regime, while they may still be in power, it's hard to say that very many people are deeply committed to the Assad regime at this point as a legitimate endeavor. Likewise, if we think about the Gulf, which was at least Danny's case study, we are seeing cracks in the extent to which people are willing to put up with those old regimes in the Gulf. Is there an opportunity to think about the Middle East not only as being about certain notions of patriarchy and bureaucratically enforced nationalisms that end up being quite discriminatory? And is statelessness one of the ways to get at that?
Yeah, I'm happy to come in, and I think, yeah, as particularly some of these regimes are weakened, we often, unfortunately, there's both an opportunity, but then there are new challenges presented, because often we see, unfortunately, the regimes resorting to further divide and rule policies. So we've seen it in Syria, where one section of the stateless Kurds are targeted with a naturalization, while another section is still excluded. And I think there've been similar, I'm certainly no expert on the Kuwaiti situation, but I've heard from colleagues that there's similar dynamics there, where sort of subsections of the Bedouin community are potentially targeted with potential solutions, be it those who have served in, equally it's the case in other contexts. Those who've served in the military might be considered in a certain more privileged category, and then it becomes very layered. So within advocacy, that's a massive challenge. How to build solidarity in this divide and rule context, when maybe there are strategic, there could be strategic or tactical gains for particular subgroups, but is that at the expense of the wider solidarity on statelessness, and how do we get around that? Yeah, I would also love to hear from our colleagues in United Stateless about, obviously, I understand that the the main focus is looking at the US in terms of advocacy, but given that the stateless people in the US often come from different parts of the world, including the Middle East, are you looking outwards as well as inwards when it comes to sort of advocacy issues?
So I can speak briefly, and then I think Danny will have more to say, but we are part of a global movement on statelessness that's led by ISI, the Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion. And they've brought together different organizations around the world who are impact-led specifically to try to help work on it at a more global level. But Danny would probably have more to say about this too.
So before I jump into that, actually the regime in Kuwait, I realized over the last 10 years has changed, targeting stateless people. I connected actually with a couple of Bedouin overseas and other colleagues, we spoke about this. So what Kuwait is trying to do is establish the same structure system as the US, as aliens. They're trying to target Kuwait's Bedouin as aliens and basically imply the same detentions and stuff like that, like the US have, which under ICE, they're trying to basically copy that into Kuwait. But then also I found out like a couple of years ago that Kuwait is actually connecting with a couple of countries in Africa, taking passports from them and giving them to the stateless community and stamping them as a visa. Meanwhile, they are not from that African country. They are technically from Kuwait, which gives the outside world like, oh, you are from this country because you have this passport. So basically they trying to shield the outside from seeing actually what's happening internally. So if a person brings up, hey, I'm stateless and I don't have a country, but that them having that African passport, they're going to tell them, oh, you are in Kuwait under a residency, staying a visa, and there shouldn't be a problem for you. But living inside, seeing what's happening, that's just a copy of really what's happening around the world. They throwing their Bedouin into other countries and saying, which was interesting because I always follow up with people about this. But United Stateless, we are basically trying to solve the issue internally in the United States, even though we are with ISI and we are part of this global movement, but our target first is in the US. If after we achieve that and we are successful, then we will be able to expand. But our main focus is actually trying to find the numbers of stateless people in the US. A lot of people don't know they are stateless or they are at the risk of being stateless. We don't know, maybe the next 5 years, this person does have a passport. The next 5 years, they become stateless. So our research actually with like CMS and trying to map stateless people, it's a long road of getting that because the US system does not have an option for statelessness. So there is, if you ever go to USCIS, there's no option for me to write stateless. They actually, what citizenship do you obtain? I just leave it blank or write stateless because I cannot say that I'm from this country because I don't have the rights to say that I'm from that country. I don't have a citizenship from that country.
Those are very interesting reflections, and it does get at the real problem with statelessness is that the bureaucracy of documentation really defines what your status is, and so your and what Danny, what you described for us is that unscrupulous bureaucracies can play around with that question of status, right? And they seem willing to do that just to try to shield themselves from international scrutiny, which is not surprising, but somewhat depressing. We have actually another sort of point, and it was coming to me as I was reading Zainab Saleh's paper, but yeah, I might throw it out there for the rest of you as well. So she's talking about the different subjectivities. She asks then why in Saleh's paper does the protagonist end up feeling at home in London, right, with these multiple subjectivities. I suppose one way to think about this is why do we end up having to go back to the old colonial metropoles to debate so many of these issues? What is it that's keeping us from, what is it that the metropoles in fact, be it the United States, be it somewhere in Europe, do they in fact provide solace, and what is it about the melting pot of the old colonial, the centers of colonial empire that can provide an opportunity for people to actually find a place if they've been rendered stateless in the Middle East in particular. And I'll just note that we could do the same thing. We could have a similar conversation with people who come from the border areas between Myanmar and Thailand, right, or countless other places in the world, which I think is part of what the United Stateless is building solidarity around. But in the Middle East in particular, we have this issue, and yet we find in the story I read that London becomes the place where people can finally be at home, right? Even with all these other subjectivities. Would you all like to comment on that?
I'm happy to give it a go.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's certainly a noticeable dynamic that we've seen within, as I was talking about, the MENA Statelessness network. So many of those who are active on statelessness advocacy relating to the Gulf are simply found in the diaspora context, and it's just generally the reality that there's the space to operate, the space to work on it freely and without the same level of risk as somebody who's speaking out on it from within said Gulf country. And then I would maybe try and relate in terms of trying to understand some of the reasons behind this dynamic, that maybe if I could link it back to some of the discussion of the bureaucratic architecture that I was focusing on in the Syria context, but then shift it over to look at, for example, Kuwait. We see that the Kuwaiti state is a significant donor to UNHCR for humanitarian aid for refugee emergency situations, regionally and beyond. But at the same time, that relationship means that essentially immobilizes UNHCR from being able to even largely publicly talk about Bidoon from Kuwait unless they happen to be refugees or asylum seekers outside the region. So UNHCR will almost never talk about statelessness relating to Kuwait unless it's framed within another context. And this essentially, this clear institutional dilemma, it's understandable that an agency like UNHCR would not want to risk its funding that it needs for operational reasons to be able to support refugees in various contexts. But at the same time, it's obviously massively problematic to have a mandate for statelessness that cannot be activated in certain contexts. I don't know.
Yeah.
Those are my current thoughts.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I noted, so we have one question in the question answer, and then Mohammed's hand is raised as well. So Mohammed, would you like to ask your question first, and then I'm going to.
Yeah, I received the question actually from via email. The question is, the UAE has reduced its stateless population significantly through a deal with the Comoros Islands, I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly, to grant its stateless citizens Comoros citizenship. How does that complicate our understanding of statelessness? These people have never been to Comoros. So I don't know who would like to answer that.
So it's a very similar dynamic to what Danny was referring to in relation to Kuwait. So basically, it's an outsourcing of statelessness issues, and it obviously it's not a proper or full solution, because it doesn't match up at all with a sense of belonging. It's just literally a random country's documents being provided based on an economic arrangement, and does not solve the issue. So yeah, it complicates things for sure, but I wouldn't consider that as a solution, or at least not an appropriate solution to statelessness.
Any of the other presenters like to comment on this? Yeah, it does sound very similar to the situation that Danny described in Kuwait. I have one other question from Andrea Althoff. Is the issue of statelessness really a consequence of arbitrary bureaucratic procedures? I write this being a German national and having worked with the German BAMF, which is the German Federal Ministry for Refugees and Migrations.
I can give it a go.
Yeah, you can. I would like to hear from Ashley, Taryn, and Danny on this as well, because I think that sounds to me like part of their story. But yeah, go ahead.
If you guys want to go for it.
So I guess if we're talking about arbitrary in more of an accidental way, I would say absolutely not. I think it's a very targeted decisions or lack of decisions, often based on discrimination or not wanting to acknowledge certain things. In the US context, I just don't think they want to address it. And so they just refuse to acknowledge it, and through that think they just don't have to address it at all. I don't know if Danny and Taryn have more to say. I
truly believe is like Ashley, what she just said is it explains this. This is basically, I feel like governments are targeting people, and it's like, if you realize that, then they become stateless, like groups of people. It could be tribes, it could be different types of groups of people, and like everybody else said, they just don't want to look at the issue. If they do look at the issue now, let's say like one of the other countries do say, hey, I have a law for stateless people, just like refugees, they could come in and apply for a residency or something like that. What's gonna happen? Everybody who are stateless will try to go to that country. So basically, each country saying, I don't want to take more than I already have. I already have a lot of refugees. Why should I take more stateless people? So basically, they blindsided and they just turned their heads to the other direction and say, we don't have this issue. We don't have this issue in our country. But meanwhile, as we realize that social media is really expanding and technology is really expanding, that right now people are doing videos, posting them on Instagram, showing how they live, explaining to people, hey, I am stateless, this is my life. Then with that video being tagged and people are tagging it in their Instagram, Facebook, that really creates attention. For example, what happened in the Dominican Republic when a lot of the citizens were stripped from their citizenship. That brought a lot of media attention because a lot of people start talking about this. Now, when I speak about statelessness, some people refer to what happened to the Dominican Republic, which is interesting because if you think about it, 10 years back, a lot of people were not talking about that because, again, the media, the news will talk about it, and then next topic, let's talk about something else. Let's talk about the refugees. Let's talk about what's happening, the wars, the other wars. But nobody's really thinking like what's happening in Syria. A lot of the children, the question of, are they stateless? Are they refugees? It's something that as we advance with technology, people will look at social media and see these videos and repost. And this is what, to me, is that this is what's gonna open a pathway for all stateless people. If people share these videos, then a lot of people will go with this movement, like what happened in the United States with the Black community. Everybody decided to march and talk about this issue, the discrimination that's happening. So it's a matter of time, but I truly believe that every country is not really looking at this issue.
Interesting. So Thomas, did you want to add anything to that?
I could maybe add something very short. So I wasn't sure exactly from what context the person asking the question was coming from, but I think it is also important to recognize that European countries like Germany are not always only dealing with statelessness that's occurred elsewhere. So I'm reminded of a colleague, and I hope she wouldn't mind me sharing this video. It's publicly available on YouTube, and it's her TEDx talk, and she's an individual who was born in Germany and has been struggling with her own statelessness, and been on an exploratory journey of trying to figure out what statelessness is. And has done incredible work on it. I don't know if I can actually post anything, but I would otherwise share a link to this TEDx talk on it, which is really impressive.
Yeah. Well, we can. I'm not sure, Mohammed. Do you know if
I don't believe we can, unfortunately, because of the current format. But if you maybe send it through email, we can just circulate it that way as well.
Sure.
Yeah,
No problem.
that would be great. So I think we are now at time, are we not, for this session?
Yes. Yep.
Which is the session before lunch. So we don't want to keep going all that much longer. It's been a fascinating conversation, however, and I think we could keep talking about this for quite some time. Thank you very much to our speakers today. They did a wonderful job. I would like to congratulate you all, and I think there are still 2 more presentations this afternoon, right? Starting again at 1:30.
Yeah, so the final panel is at 1:30, and then for all the presenters, we'll be having a closing session from 2:45. Realistically, it probably will start at 3 to 3:45. But anyway, so we have 2 more sessions. That's right.
Great. Well, fantastic. We'll look forward to those this afternoon. And everyone have a wonderful lunch for a little period of time.